Welcome to Hearing the Truth Radio. This is the only radio show that is 100% fact. That's right. By listening to this show, you're listening to the facts and interpretations as they pertain to the Bible. While the hosts of this program are human, the messages are divine and comes by inspiration and prayer. Today's show is the first part of a large study called The System of Antichrist. The study of the System of Antichrist will continue throughout ongoing shows throughout the weeks. If any of the listeners, which means you, miss any of these studies, we encourage them, which is you, to go to our website to the audio library section. In previous shows, we've discussed that the modern system of dispensationalism is a product of the Counter-Reformation. D.S. Ferris, you're back on the show again. Nice to have you here as always.
It's a pleasure to be on this program.
D.S., you've told us that the Jesuits developed futurism from ideas that stem back to the extra-biblical writings, like the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. And what amazed me is the fact that futurism has its foundations on the Beliar myth. Beliar looks more like a comic book character of grandiose fiction than a product of Bible prophecy.
That is correct, Mike. Absolute grandiose fiction. The Jesuits are the architects of the futurist system, and the main foundation of that system is found in the Beliar myth. Beliar was a mythical anti-Messiah, a man possessing all the power of the devil who was to come and persecute the Jews before the first advent. This character was intermingled with a distorted version of the 70 weeks found in the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, a pseudepigraphal work in existence over 100 years before the first advent of Christ. This Beliar-based pseudepigraphal work helped to misconstrue the 70th week of Daniel 9 into a future tribulation period. Mike, make note that at some point in these shows, we are going to have a discussion on the true interpretation of the 70 weeks of Daniel 9.
Okay, D.S., let's get right to it. Now, you've told us that futurism was developed by the Jesuits to destroy the Protestant interpretation of prophecy. You've emphasized that the Protestants of the Reformation time applied the method of historicism to the Bible, and this method reveals that the Pope and his kingdom constitute the true Antichrist.
That is correct. The Protestant reformers sought to eliminate the pseudepigraphal myths of Beliar and find the true meaning of prophecy. To the Protestants, historicism was the most consistent methodology of interpretation. And why is this the case? Historicism as a system is congruous with the nature of God. God's nature is described in Revelation chapter 1, verses 4 and 8 as being He who is, and who was, and who is to come. God's prophecies are inextricably tied into His nature. Take note of Isaiah 46, verses 9 and 10. Isaiah 46, verses 9 and 10 says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none other. I am God, and there is none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning." Now notice that. Declaring the end from the beginning. "And from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." Now note this clearly. The great I Am of the Bible, the self-existing one, is able to declare the end from the beginning prophetically because He was in the past, He is in the present, and He will be in the future. In light of this threefold aspect of the great I Am, it is important to realize that prophecy is congruous with this nature. Revelation chapter 1 verse 19 says, "Write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this." Now note this clearly. John was told to write the things which he had seen pertaining to the past, to write the things which were going on in the present, and to write the things which would take place in the future. Hence, the things written in Revelation pertain to the past, the present, and the future, inasmuch as the God who declares the end from the beginning is He who is and was and is to come. Now, the reformers came to realize that prophecy moves progressively, for prophecy is in alignment with the nature of God. The prophecies in Daniel and Revelation span the church period and pertain to the church. This is why Revelation 22:16 says, I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. Now, what does he mean here by these things? Let us look at this verse again. I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things, meaning the prophecies in Revelation in the churches. Revelation 22:16 unequivocally says that the prophecies written in Revelation pertain to the churches. And why is this the case? Because prophecy pertains to the past, the present, and the future. That's why in Revelation chapter 1, verse 19, John was commanded to write the things which he had seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this. And of course, John was writing prophecy in alignment with the nature of God, because God's nature is he who was and is to come.
I like that analysis. The God who declares the end from the beginning is the God who exists in the present, the past, and the future. And prophecy pertains to the present, the past, and the future. In other words, the past establishes the present, and the present establishes the future. Therefore, historicism is based on consistent reality.
Well said, Mike. Dr. Froome also explains the logic of applying historicism to prophecy rather than futurism. Dr. Froome says, futurism removes the application from the tangible check of historical fulfillment where it can be tested, and gets it into the future where necessarily imaginative treatment of predicted but as yet unfulfilled events cannot be checked against anything solid or historical as a guide. It is therefore without limit as to the speculative possibilities that can scarcely be gainsaid. If literalism leads to absurdities, futurism of application leads to fantasy. And that is Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, Volume 2, Appendices, page 802. Now, concerning futurism, Froome speaks of imaginative prophecies that cannot be measured against anything solid. That is the case. To take the bulk of Daniel and Revelation and make all these writings leap over centuries into a time frame of 7 years, which has not yet come, is to measure prophecy purely on speculation. When Froome said futurism leads to fantasy, that is absolutely correct. Futurism makes the nature of God and prophecy inexplicable, for it makes prophecy an enigma of the most grotesque speculation. Futurism is not founded upon a solid principle of prophecy based on past to present fulfillments of realities which define future realities. Futurism simply jumps from past to future, leaving the present unchecked. Thus, the future really cannot be understood as anything other than mirages of human speculation. It is absolutely imperative that we grasp prophecy through the consistent revelation of the great I Am, that is the self-existing one. This is progressive revelation, not comic book fiction and not Walt Disney-like fantasy.
Not Walt Disney-like fantasy. No, that's absolutely correct. That's absolutely right. Now that you've established the importance of historicism as being the consistent and unbroken revelation of the God who is, who was, and who is to come, now establish the historical position of the papal Antichrist. For example, would you teach the historical position of Daniel 7?
Yes.
Show us how the symbols of the little horn point to the papal system through the Middle Ages.
Yes, that is exactly what we are going to do. We can get started by reading Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. Daniel chapter 7 verse 1 says, In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. 2. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. 3. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. Now, before we go any further, let us clarify the meaning of certain symbols that are relevant to our study. In prophecy, winds can represent wars and calamity. See Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 30 through 33. And Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. The sea, or prophetic waters, represent the masses of humanity. See Isaiah chapter 17, verses 12 and 13, Jeremiah chapter 46, verses 7 and 8, and Revelation chapter 17, verse 15. Beasts represent kingdoms. Daniel chapter 7 verse 23 says, "The fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms." So in other words, according to Daniel chapter 7 verses 1 through 3, Daniel saw the four winds of strife, war, and calamity blowing on the great sea of humanity, and as a result, four great kingdoms came into existence. Now, there is another symbol that we must underscore at this time, for it pertains to our study. Horns, too, represent kingdoms. Daniel chapter 8, verse 22 says, "As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place," meaning the four horns that stood up in its place, "four kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power." Now, let us move on to the following verses. Verse 4. Daniel chapter 7 verse 4. "The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it." Now, most scholars agree that the lion is the kingdom of Babylon, which ruled from 606 through 538 BC. Verse 5. "And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh." Most scholars agree that the bear is the kingdom of Medo-Persia, which ruled from 538 through 331 BC. Verse 6. "After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." Most scholars agree that the leopard is the kingdom of Greece, which ruled from 331 through 168 BC. Now verse 7. "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Most scholars agree that the fourth beast is the Roman Empire, which ruled from 168 BC through AD 476.
That is true when you say most evangelicals. Most of them, even among dispensationalists, believe that the 4 beasts represent those kingdoms: Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. The problem arises when we get into the interpretation of the 10 horns and the little horn. The Jesuits believe that the 10 horns and the little horn have been sawed off of the consistent flow of history and thrown up in the distant future.
That is correct. However, as we are going to see, that is not the case. The 10 horns and the little horn came right in order through history, right after the fourth beast, right after the Roman Empire. Now, it is apparent that dispensationalists believe that the 10 divisions of Rome have not come into being as of yet. The dispensationalist Clarence Larkin, for example, said, "These 10 toes," and of course he's referring to the great metallic image of Daniel 2, he says, "These 10 toes have not as yet manifested themselves, so the historical fulfillment of the image is not yet complete," and that's Larkin, the book of Daniel, page 48. Now, we can hardly believe how blatantly dispensationalists overlook historical realities. They overlook the fact that this division has already taken place. The 10 toes of Daniel chapter 2, verses 41 through 43, or the 10 horns of Daniel chapter 7, verses 7, 20, and 24, are not awaiting some future arrival, not at all. This division came about between the years AD 376 through 476. Will Durant tells us the following. He says, "In the heart of Europe, bounded by the Vistula, the Danube, and the Rhine, moved the restless tribes that were to remake the map and rename the nations of Europe. Thuringians, Burgundians, Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, Capeti, Quade, Vandals, Alemanni, Suevi, Lombards, and Franks." And that's the story of civilization, the age of faith, page 22. Adovaker, the leader of the Arian Heruli, conquered western Rome in 476 and removed the last of the Roman emperors and ruled as the king of Italy in the west. And you can find this information in the Age of Faith, pages 42 and 43. It took 100 years, roughly between 376 through 476, to cause Rome to break into these divisions. Durant says on page 43 of the Age of Faith, he says, "The empire in the West faded, but the states of modern Europe were born."
In the past, I've heard it argued that between the years 376 to 476, there were more than 10 tribes in the Roman Empire seeking power. Dispensationalists often use this as proof that the 10 divisions of Rome are still future, but that's not so. What do you think of this outlook?
I think the 19th century writer T.R. Burks perceptively counters this idea. He says the 10 horns may not be strictly permanent, but admit of partial change. Some may perhaps fall or be blended and then replaced by others. The tenfold character may thus be dominant through the whole and appear distinctly at the beginning and close of their history, though not strictly maintained every moment. Let's stop here for a moment in Burke's argument. According to Burks, different tribes would appear for a period of time, then disappear. He says different tribes would often blend in together. Now, let's continue with the quote. Burke says, "A tenfold division, such as some have looked for, mathematical and unvaried, would frustrate one half of the prediction, and would deprive the rest of all its freedom and moral grandeur. But now every part is alike accomplished. At the same time, by these partial changes in the list of doomed kingdoms, the reproach of a stern fatalism which otherwise would cloud the equity of divine providence is rolled away. And that is the 4 prophetic empires and the kingdom of Messiah, pages 143, 144, and 152. In other words, according to Burks, the symbolism of the number 10 represents the wholeness of a group of kingdoms. Mathematical precision could not be a determining factor because the disappearing of tribes and the blending together of others would often fluctuate the numbers, according to T.R. Burks. I completely agree with Burks that ultimately the conceptual essence of wholeness in the number 10 is what is most important. However, after 476 AD, among disappearing and blending of tribes, 10 very significant powers did come into being. 7 of these powers still exist, and 3 of them disappeared from history. And they are as follows: the Alemanni, the Germans; the Burgundians, the Swiss; the Franks, the French; the Lombards, the Italians; the Saxons, the English; the Suevi, the Portuguese; the Visigoths, the Spanish; the Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. Now, it is our belief that these 10 powers are the 10 horns. Why? Because 7 still exist, and the 3 that were destroyed played a very, very significant role around the rise of papal power. This is an issue that we are going to explain later in this study.
In light of the apparent consecutive fulfillment of the world kingdoms, it seems logical to conclude that the Antichrist, or little horn, must also follow in the same pattern. If the pagan Roman Empire existed between 168 BC and AD 476, and the breakup of Rome immediately followed, why wouldn't the little horn immediately follow? It only makes sense that the little horn power came consecutively after these historical events, right?
Yes, that is correct, and that is precisely the truth that the Protestant Reformation came to realize. For example, the English reformer John Wycliffe, between 1324 and 1384, known as the Morning Star of the Reformation, is very important in church history. And why is that? Durant tells us the reasons. He says, all the major elements of the Reformation were in Wycliffe. And that is the Reformation, page 37. Wycliffe understood that prophecy pertains to the past, the present, and the future. Wycliffe also knew about the Beliar myth, for he debunked that idea as he elucidated on the papacy being the fulfillment of the little horn. Wycliffe says in the following, he says, "Why is it necessary in unbelief to look for another Antichrist? Hence, in the 7th chapter of Daniel, Antichrist is forcefully described by a horn arising in the time of the 4th kingdom. For it grew from among our powerful ones, more horrible, more cruel, and more greedy. Because by reckoning the pagans and our Christians by name, A greater struggle for the temporals is not recorded in any preceding time. Therefore, the 10 horns are the whole of our temporal rulers, and the horn has arisen from the 10 horns, having eyes and a mouth speaking great things against the lofty one, and wearing out the saints of the Most High, and thinking that he is able to change times and laws. And that's cited in Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, Volume 2, page 55. John Wycliffe emphasized in his writings that the Roman Catholic system and the Pope of Rome constitute the fulfillment of the prophecy of the little horn.
All right. I remember reading in your book, Prophetic Tool Chest, that there are 10 very important identifying marks of the little horn. You emphasize that these marks reveal that the papacy is the Antichrist power.
Yes, that is true. Let me name off these identifying marks, then we will look at a portion of them on today's program.
Okay.
In Daniel chapter 7, there are 10 outstanding marks for identifying who the little horn power is. And they are as follows. Number 1, the little horn comes out of the 4th beast, meaning pagan Rome. Number 2, the little horn comes out of the 4th beast among the 10 horns, meaning the little horn emerges out of the Roman Empire among the divided kingdoms of Rome. Number 3, the little horn is different than the surrounding horn kingdoms. Number 4, the little horn is more powerful than the surrounding horn kingdoms. Number 5, the little horn uproots 3 of the horns, meaning the little horn destroys 3 kingdoms. Now points 6 and 7 are tied in together. The little horn has eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth that speaks pompous words against God, meaning there is a human figurehead of the greatest importance in the kingdom of Antichrist who blasphemes God. Point number 8, the little horn destroys God's true people. Point number 9, the little horn would think to change God's set times and laws. Point number 10, the little horn would rule for 1,260 prophetic days. Now, today we will cover a portion of these identifying marks, and on the next program we will continue with the identifying marks that remain. It is important to realize that dispensationalists believe that these identifying marks have not been fulfilled by any power as of yet, but must be fulfilled in the future in an incarnate devil man during a 7-year tribulation. That is absolutely false. Let us examine each of these points in relation to the papacy and forever remove the Beliar man from our theology. Let us begin with point number 1. Daniel chapter 7, verses 7 and 8 tells us that the little horn was to arise out of the 4th beast. Did the papacy come out of pagan Rome? Yes. A historian in the earliest part of the 20th century, A.C. Flick, emphasizes the following. Out of the ruins of political Rome arose the great moral empire in the giant form of the Roman Church, and that is the rise of the medieval church, page 150. Note this clearly. It was the Roman Catholic Church that came out of Rome. Flick further emphasizes in that same source the following. He says, the removal of the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople in 330 left the Western Church practically free from imperial power to develop its own form of organization. The Bishop of Rome and the seat of the Caesars was now the greatest man in the West, and was soon, when the barbarians overrun the empire, forced to become the political as well as the spiritual head. And that is the rise of the medieval church, page 168. When the Heruli removed the last of the Western Roman emperors in 476, it was the Catholic Church that brought order back to the West. Durant emphasizes the following, quote, to the Church, more than to any other institution, Europe owed the resurrection of civilization in the West after the barbarian inundation of Italy, Gaul, Britain, and Spain, end of quote. And that is the Reformation, page 5. The old-time Baptist, Henry H. Halley, in 1927, tells us the following. He says, the desire for worldly power began to manifest itself in the church on a broad scale in the 4th century when the Roman Empire ceased its persecutions and made Christianity its state religion. The spirit of imperial Rome passed into the church. The church gradually developed itself into the empire it had conquered. The popes of Rome were the heirs and successors of the Caesars of Rome. The Vatican is where the palace of the Caesars was. The popes have claimed all the authority the Caesars claimed and more, and that is Halley's Bible Handbook, pages 731 and 732. It is unequivocal that the Roman Catholic Church is the successor of the Caesars, sitting in the very spot where the Caesars ruled. So, who came out of the fourth beast? The papacy did. The Roman Catholic Church came out of the pagan Roman Empire.
Okay, in this section of your book, DS, you emphasized that, here's what you said, after 476, the popes became the successors of the Caesars in the West, ruling in the very spot where the Caesars and emperors ruled. The Eastern Roman emperors in Constantinople, the Eastern Empire, came to an end in 1453 after being conquered by the Muslim Empire, the Ottoman Turks. After the fall of Constantinople, Roman civilization was known only in the West, with the Pope as its head. It's without dispute in history that the Roman Church was, in its very essence, the continuation of the pagan Roman Empire, just like you said. That history is so plain that I remember hearing a dispensational speaker telling his audience that the Antichrist will come out of a future revived Roman Empire. That makes no sense to me. Rome fell in 476, and the Pope emerged during and after that time frame as the successor of the Caesars. So it's also clear that papal Rome succeeded pagan Rome.
Yes, that history is plain, and let me show you how plain it gets on the following points. Point number 2. Daniel chapter 7 verse 8 tells us that the little horn emerged among the 10 horns. Did the papacy emerge as a prominent power among the 10 horns after the year 476? Absolutely. Karl Conrad Eckhart, back in 1937, has told us the following: under the Roman Empire, the popes had no temporal powers, but when the Roman Empire had disintegrated and its place had been taken by a number of rude barbarous kingdoms, the Roman Catholic Church not only became independent of the states in religious affairs, but dominated secular affairs as well, and that comes from the Papacy and World Affairs, page 1. Adolf Harnack, back in 1909, has told us the following. He says, whatever Roman elements the barbarians and Arians left came under the protection of the Bishop of Rome, who was the chief person there after the emperor's disappearance. The Roman Church in this way privily pushed itself into the place of the Roman world empire, of which it is the actual continuation. The empire has not perished, but has only undergone a transformation. That is no mere clever remark, but the recognition of the true state of the matter historically, and the most appropriate and fruitful way of describing the character of this church. It still governs the nations. It is a political creation, and as imposing as a world empire. The Pope who calls himself King and Pontifex Maximus is Caesar's successor. And that comes from What is Christianity? Pages 269 and 270.
The Pope who calls himself King and Pontifex Maximus is Caesar's successor. Yep, that makes complete sense. During the time of the barbarian invasions, the papacy was emerging in the place of Rome and a Christian form of the Roman Empire. So in other words, when Europe was in its beginning stages, the papacy was rising up as the leader, taking the place of the old Roman Caesar.
Let's look at the third point. Daniel chapter 7 verse 24 tells us that the little horn was to be different than the surrounding horns. This identifying mark is described well by John Dowling. Dowling tells us, soon after Constantine's professed conversion to Christianity, he undertook to remodel the government of the church so as to make it conform as much as possible to the government of the state. Hence, the origin of the dignities of patriarchs, exarchs, archbishops, canons, prebendaries, and etc., intended by the emperor to correspond with the different secular offices and dignities connected with the civil administration of the empire. Taking these newly constituted dignitaries of the church into his own special favor, he loaded them with wealth and worldly honors, and richly endowed the churches over which they presided, thus fostering in those who professed to be the followers and ministers of him who was meek and lowly in heart, a spirit of worldly ambition, pride, and avarice. And that comes from the History of Romanism, from the earliest corruptions of Christianity to the present time, page 31. The difference between the Catholic Church and the other tribes that were forming into the European nations is that the Roman Church was a religious political power destined to be the leader over the European countries. Ultimately, the differences between the little horn and the other horns are realized by all the identifying marks of the little horn. Now let us go to point number 4. Daniel chapter 7 verse 20 tells us that the little horn's look was more stout than the other horns. Let us raise the question, was the papacy more powerful than the other European powers? The great 19th century Protestant historian J.A. Wiley tells us the following. He says, for several centuries together, we see the popes reigning over Europe and demeaning themselves in every way as not only its spiritual but also its temporal lords. We see them freely distributing immunities, titles, revenues, territories as if all belonged to them. We see them sustaining themselves arbiters in all disputes, umpires in all quarrels, and judges in all causes. We see them giving provinces and crowns to their favorites and constituting emperors. We see them imposing oaths of fidelity and vassalage on monarchs. And, in token of the dependence of the one and the supremacy of the other, we see them exacting tribute for their kingdoms in the shape of Peter's pence. We see them raising wars and crusades, summoning princes and kings into the field, attiring them in their livery the cross, and holding them but as lieutenants under them. In fine, how often have they deposed monarchs and laid their kingdoms under interdict? History presents us with a list of not less than 64 emperors and kings deposed by the popes. Let us read that last statement again. History presents us with a list of not less than 64 emperors and kings deposed by the popes. And that comes from the Papacy, History, Dogmas, Genius, and Prospects. Book 1, page 102. Now, Durant also demonstrates how the popes were the rulers of European civilization. He tells us, amid all complaints and revolts, the popes continued to assert their absolute sovereignty over the kings of the earth. Do you hear that? The popes continued to assert their absolute sovereignty over the kings of the earth. About 1324, under the patronage of John XXII, Augustino Triunfo wrote a Summa Dei Potestate Ecclesiastica in reply to attacks on the papacy by Marsilius of Padua and William of Ockham. The power of the Pope, said Augustino, is from God, whose vicegerent he is on earth. Even when he is a great sinner, he must be obeyed. He may be deposed by a general council of the church for manifest heresy, but short of this, his authority is second only to God's and transcends that of all earthly potentates. He may dethrone kings and emperors at will, even over the protest of their people or the electors. He may annul the decrees of secular rulers, and may set aside the constitution of states. No decree of any prince is valid unless the Pope gives it his consent. The Pope stands higher than the angels and may receive equal reverence with the Virgin and the saints. And that comes from the Story of Civilization, the Reformation, page 8. Now, after reading these paragraphs of papal power, it is well worth reading the description of the Antichrist in Daniel chapter 11, verse 36, where it says, then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. Now, concerning Daniel 11:36, the great reformer of Germany, Martin Luther, emphasized. He said, here the Pope is clearly pictured, who in all his decrees shouts impudently that all the churches and thrones will be judged by him. But he cannot be judged by anyone, and cap solite, as the sun is superior to the moon, so the Pope is superior to the emperor. And wherever authority is, there is power to command, and others are obliged to obey. And that comes from Luther's Schriften, volume 6, column 917.
So let's pause for a moment. Up to this point, the prophecy of Daniel 7 tells us that the little horn was to come out of Rome, was to come up among the divided kingdoms, was to be different than the other kingdoms, and was to be more powerful than the divided kingdoms. Every one of these marks matches the history of the papacy.
Let's look at point number 5. Daniel chapter 7 verses 8, 20, and 24 tell us that the little horn uprooted 3 of the first horns by the roots. Did the Roman Catholic Church uproot 3 horns? Yes, they did. The Catholic Church managed to uproot 3 very significant Arian powers: the Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. Now, in order to truly grasp the connection of these historical events with the prophecy in Daniel 7, we are going to explain the background of different issues that are intricately connected to the fall of these powers. In the year AD 325, the First Catholic Ecumenical Council took place. This council is known as the Council of Nicaea. During this council, there was a great debate concerning the deity of Christ. Athanasius, known as the Father of the Trinity, debated that Jesus was co-substantial and co-eternal with the Father. However, his opponent Arius taught that Jesus was the Son of God, but not equal with the Father. During this time frame, the barbarian hordes began to take shape, and in the following years they invaded Rome. Now, why is this important? Durant asserts the following. He says Christianity had been first carried to the Teutonic tribes by Roman captives taken in the Gothic invasions of Asia Minor in the 3rd century, and that is the Age of Faith, page 46. The Christian view that became pervasive among the barbarians was the Arian view, that is the view of Arius. Durant says, Arianism overcame within the empire, won a peculiar victory among the barbarians, and that is the Age of Faith, page 46. It was the Goths, the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, who became the champions of Arianism, and the Goths influenced the other tribes into this belief. Durant tells us, as the other barbarians received their Christianity in the 4th and 5th centuries from the Goths, nearly all the invaders of the empire were Arians, and the new kingdoms established by them in the Balkans, Gaul, Spain, Italy, and Africa were officially Arian, and that is the Age of Faith, page 47. Now, it is very important to realize, in looking at this history, that the Nicene Creed became a very important pillar in the Catholic Church, and Arianism undermined this creed. Arianism, in its essence, was a force that kept papal power in check. For example, in 476, Rome fell to the Arian Heruli, and their leader Adovacar ruled Italy as king. In other words, the Western Catholic Church had to contend with rulers that were in opposition to Catholic dogma, and they had to contend with rulers that were in opposition to the Catholic struggle for supremacy. Now, during this time frame, the Eastern Catholic Empire, Constantinople, too, had to contend with Arianism. The Arian Ostrogoths were in the east, and they were in a position to overtake Constantinople. At the same time that this situation with the Heruli and Ostrogoths was going on, the Arian Vandals were located in North Africa, and they constantly sailed to different provinces of the Roman Empire to destroy and loot for the sake of wealth and power.
In other words, D.S. Ferris, these 3 powers hindered the Catholic Church from becoming the absolute authority over Europe.
Yes, Mike, and it was important that the Catholic Church develop a strategy to overthrow these powers. The success of this endeavor would ensure that the Catholic Church become the most powerful force in Europe. Let us note that the success of this endeavor would allow that the Catholic Church to not only be a church, but to become the papacy. Now, concerning the Arian situation that we are discussing, McEvedy tells us the following. He says, Adovacar's success stimulated the mistrust of the Eastern Romans. The government of Constantinople had been having increasing trouble with its Ostrogothic federates, and as it stood to profit by his success or failure, encouraged Theodoric the Ostrogoth to invade Italy. And this comes from the Penguin Atlas of Medieval History, page 24. McEvedy also says the following. After a hard-fought war between 489 through 493 and some judicious treachery, Theodoric made himself master of an enlarged Italian kingdom. And that's the Penguin Atlas of Medieval History, page 24. So, according to history, The Ostrogoths were bribed by the Catholic emperor in the east to conquer the Arian Heruli, who were ruling in the west. After 493, the Heruli disappeared from history. The Catholic Church managed the elimination of one of the Arian horns, according to history. However, their problems were not over, because the Ostrogoths, whom the Catholic Church deceived, took the place of the Heruli in Italy and became the rulers of the West. Now, with the Vandals and the Ostrogoths still hindering the potential of the papal supremacy, the Catholic Church would find the resolution to their problems in the leadership of Justinian. In 526, Justinian became the emperor in the Eastern Empire. Justinian was known as the imperial theologian. He took church theology and Roman law very seriously. In 528, Justinian set forth to revise Roman law and combine it with Christian orthodoxy into a new code that was to govern his empire. The first copy of this work was published in 533. Justinian's code became known as Corpus Juris Civilis, meaning body of civil law. And this code enacted Orthodox Christianity into law.
Well, it appears that the Code of Justinian would have been the foundation to allow the Catholic Church to expand into the empire it became.
That's true. The Code of Justinian was, in effect, the legal blueprint for the papal supremacy. During the process of Justinian's endeavors to unite both Roman and papal law through his code, he realized that a united kingdom under the jurisdiction of the imperial papal power was not possible as long as the Vandals and Ostrogoths continued to maintain power. This situation is well described by Charles Diel in the following: in spite of every difficulty, the imperial diplomacy never lost sight of any event that might further the accomplishment of Justinian's plans. Occurrences in the Vandal kingdom in Africa and the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy were carefully watched for the profit of the empire. In Africa, as in Italy, everything was in favor of the imperial restoration. The Roman people, governed by barbarian kings, had kept alive the memory of the empire and looked impatiently to Constantinople for a deliverer. And this comes from the Cambridge Medieval History, 2nd edition, The Rise of the Saracens and the Foundation of the Western Empire, Volume 2, page 9. So, in the year 533, the very year of the first publication of Justinian's Code, Justinian made war on these Arian powers. Diel tells us in the following: on the 22nd of June, 533, Belisarius embarked for the west. 10,000 infantry and from 5,000 to 6,000 cavalry were shipped in 500 transport ships manned by 20,000 sailors. A fleet of warships manned by 2,000 oarsmen convoyed the expedition. The Vandals could offer little resistance to these forces, and that is the Cambridge Medieval History, Volume 2, page 12. Now, what was the result of Justinian and Belisarius' enterprise? Charles Diel says the following: in 534, in a few months, contrary to all expectations, a few cavalry regiments had destroyed Gaisaric's kingdom. And that is the Cambridge Medieval History, Volume 2, page 13. This was the second Arian horn that the Catholic Church removed, and that is the Vandals. The Vandals were the second Arian horn that the Catholic Church removed. The Ostrogoths became the third Arian horn. Dr. Froome gives a year-by-year outline of the destruction of the Arian Vandals and Ostrogoths as follows. In 533, Justinian's general Belisarius embarks for Africa. In 534, Vandal kingdom destroyed. In 535, Belisarius lands in Sicily, beginning the Ostrogothic War. In 536, Belisarius garrisons Rome. In 537, March of 537, Ostrogothic King Witiges, with 150,000 Goths, vainly seeks to retake Rome in a one-year siege. 538 of March, another Roman army landing in Italy. Witiges, in despair, abandons the siege of Rome, falling back to Ravenna. And in 553, you have the defeat of Thea and the end of the Ostrogothic War, and this is found in the Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, Volume 2, Penances, page 935. So note this clearly. The Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths were the most prominent and pervasive of the followers of Arius' doctrine. It is a fact of history that these three powers stood in the way of the papal supremacy. It was only after these powers were removed that Rome was liberated to expand into the most powerful political, ecclesiastical institution that the world has ever seen. The Code of Justinian, which codified Catholic and Roman law into a unified structure, was the binding fabric of the emerging papal power. But here's the thing. Justinian's code would have been meaningless had he not conquered these Arian powers. And what does that mean? That means if they had never conquered these Arian powers, there would not have been the papacy. So yes, this is very, very significant history.
Well, that is important. And it's apparent that the Catholic Church matches the fifth identifying mark of the little horn. I've often heard modern futurists argue that the little horn will come up and uproot three horns in the future, but none of that made any sense because it's all speculation. What you are saying is based on concrete reality.
And another point to be noted is that Daniel chapter 7 verse 8 says that the little horn uprooted three of the first horns. Notice that, first horns, in relation to the other horns. The Aramaic for this word is kodmei, meaning former, previous, first. This word indicates that the three horns in question belong to the time frame when Rome was being divided, meaning between 376 through 476. In other words, this word indicates that the three horns belong to the divided kingdoms in their infancy, meaning when Europe was first being formed. Now, after reading all this history, it is not difficult to realize why the reformer Heinrich Bullinger, between 1504 through 1575, identified the papacy as the little horn. Bullinger said the following: "By the little horn many understand the kingdom of Mohammed, of the Saracens, and of the Turks. But when the apostolic prophecy in 2 Thessalonians 2 is more carefully examined, it seems that this prophecy of Daniel and that prophecy of the apostle belong more rightly to the kingdom of the Roman Pope, which kingdom has arisen from small beginnings and has increased to an immense size." Absolutely correct. Heinrich Bullinger knew exactly what he was talking about.
I can see now with more clarity why the Jesuits developed futurism to destroy the Protestant interpretation of historicism. Because historicism reveals so clearly who the real Antichrist is. Please continue. I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of these identifying marks. And everyone else is too.
Let's move on to points 6 and 7. Daniel chapter 7 verse 8 and verse 25 tell us that the little horn had eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth that spoke great things. That is, great words against the Most High. As we have noted, horns are kingdoms, but the little horn has eyes like the eyes of a man. This imagery points us to a human position of authority. The imagery of the horn with the eyes of a man agrees with 2 Thessalonians 2 verses 1 through 4, which describe the man of sin. Note this and note this clearly. The position of popery is the Pontifex Maximus, borrowed from pagan Rome and made to represent political power as well as religious power. According to Catholic sources, the position of Pontifex Maximus, or Supreme Pontiff of Rome, has entitled the Pope to act as God on earth. The Catholic Church says the following. They say, "Christ entrusted his office to the chief pontiff, but all power in heaven and in earth has been given to Christ. Therefore the chief pontiff, who is his vicar, will have this power." And this is found in Corpus Juris Canonici, 1555 through 56, volume 3, book 1, chapter 1, column 29. It is very important to realize that, according to Daniel, the little horn would speak great things, and this in conjunction with a human position which usurps the position of Christ. And that is exactly what we just read in the last citation from the papacy. Michael Scheifler, on his web link www.biblelight.net/prompta.htm, gives links to important Catholic writings that reveal how the Pope fulfills the position of the man of sin. An example of this is Lucius Ferraris Prompta Bibliotheca, Article 2, Volume 5, the 1858 edition, columns 1823 through 1824. Let us now analyze some of Scheifler's findings in these columns. We're going to Article number 2 and point number 1. The Pope is of so great dignity and so exalted that he is not mere man, but as it were God and the vicar of God. Now, did everybody hear this? Note this clearly. Point number 1 of Article 2. The Pope is of so great dignity and so exalted that he is not mere man, but as it were God and the vicar of God. Point number 3. The Pope is the Father of fathers. Point number 4. Therefore, he alone holds the office of Supreme Pontiff. Point number 7. The Pope alone merits to be called most holy. Why? Now, we're still on point number 7, but we're going into column 1826. It reads, the Pope alone is deservedly called by the name most holy, because he alone is the vicar of Christ, who is the fountain, source, and fullness of all holiness. Point number 11, he is a bishop with jurisdiction over the whole globe. Point number 12, he is likewise the divine monarch and supreme emperor and king of kings. Point number 13, hence the Pope is crowned with a triple crown, as king of heaven and of earth and of hell. Point number 14, moreover, the superiority and the power of the Roman pontiff by no means pertains only to heavenly things, but also earthly things and to things under the earth, and even over the angels whom he is greater than. Do you see what we're reading here? Point number 15. So that if it were possible that the angels might err in the faith, or might think contrary to the faith, they could be judged and excommunicated by the Pope. Point number 16, for he is of so great dignity and power that he forms one and the same tribunal with Christ. Point number 17, so that whatever the Pope does seems to proceed from the mouth of God. Point number 18, as to papal authority, the Pope is as it were God on earth, sole sovereign of all the faithful of Christ, chief King of kings, having a plenitude of unbroken power, entrusted by the omnipotent God to govern the earthly and heavenly kingdoms. This is blasphemy. This is speaking great words against the Most High. And if the audience wants to see a more complete list of this, we emphasize to you right now to go to www.biblelite.net/prompta.htm.
How asinine. This guy actually claims to be all those things. Wow. You talk about having an ego. Does this situation get any worse?
Oh, yes. Let's continue for a while longer on this issue. Has the papacy spoke great things against the Most High, as Daniel warned? Absolutely. Lucius Ferraris is not the only one who has emphasized papal blasphemies, for the Jesuit Bellarmine in 1628 maintained the following: all names which in the Scriptures are applied to Christ, by virtue of which it is established that he is over the Church, all the same names are applied to the Pope, and that is Disputationis De Controversis, Book 2, Chapter 17, Volume 1, page 266. Now, in the Fifth Lateran Council, 4th session, Christopher Marcellus told the Pope, and the Pope did not argue with him, the following: for thou art the shepherd, thou art the physician, thou art the directorer, thou art the husbandman, finally thou art another God on earth. The reformer William Tyndale, between 1484 through 1536, spent his whole career going through his front door only to exit out the back door when papal soldiers came to arrest him on charges of heresy. In 1536, he was burned at the stake. And why was he burned? Tyndale grew tired of hearing blasphemous orations like that of Christopher Marcellus. It was Tyndale who emphasized the following: now, though the Bishop of Rome and his sect give Christ these names, yet in that they rob him of the effect, and take the significations of his names unto themselves, and make of him but an hypocrite, as they themselves be. They be the right antichrists, and deny both the Father and the Son. And that is Works, Volume 2, Expositions and Notes. The exposition of the first epistle of St. John, page 183. Now, Tyndale, like the other reformers, witnessed the reality of the man of sin in the papal system. Tyndale also declared the following: "And they have set up the great idol, the whore of Babylon, Antichrist of Rome, whom they call the Pope, and have conspired against all commonwealths, and have made them a several kingdom, wherein it is lawful unpunished to work all abomination." And that is Works, Volume 1, Doctrinal Treatise, The Obedience of a Christian Man, page 191. Is it amazing? We should ask, is it amazing that Christopher Marcellus said the Pope is another god on earth? No, not at all, because Pope Gregory IX emphasized this very thing. It was Gregory IX who said, "For not man, but God separates those whom the Roman pontiff, who exercises the functions not of mere man, but of the true God, having weighed the necessity or benefit of the churches, dissolves not by human, but rather by divine authority." And that is the Decretals of Gregory IX, Book 1, Title 7, Chapter 3, and Corpus Juris Canonici, 1555 through 56, Volume 2, Column 203.
I'm amused. Diaz, earlier you cited a document in which it was said the Pope wore a triple crown. Tell us more about this triple crown.
Yes, Lucius Ferrarus in his Prompta Bibliotheca emphasized that the Pope wears a triple crown and is King of heaven and earth and hell. I must emphasize that the best information I have seen on this matter is found in Scheifler's web link, www.biblelite.net/claims.htm Lauderdale. Scheifler not only gives good documentation, but he illustrates many pictures of these crowns. I highly recommend that the audience see this site. This site is excellent. Now, going back to what you said, Mike, yes, it is a fact that the popes in ceremonial matters wear the triple crown as a symbol of their absolute authority. We should ask, is this something new? Not likely. The reformers grew tired of this imagery. For example, Thomas Cranmer, between 1489 through 1556, was Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1535, he renounced his allegiance to the papacy and became another reformer who sided with the Protestant Reformation. In 1553, he was imprisoned and burned at the stake a few years later. Why was Cranmer burned? He grew tired of the Pope's triple crown and realized that the Pope was indeed the man of lawlessness. It was Cranmer who emphasized the following: "After all these sprung up the Pope, that triple crown monster and great Antichrist, which took upon him authority not only over the clergy, but also climbed above kings and emperors, deposing them at his pleasure, and settled himself in the temple of God, that is, in the consciences of men, extolling himself above God, dispensing with good laws, and giving men leave to break them, and to regard more his decrees than the everlasting commandments of God." And that is the Works of Thomas Cranmer, Miscellaneous Writings and Letters, Volume 2, page 15. Cranmer apparently matched the Pope with the description of the little horn in Daniel 7:25. This image of the Pope, along with his actions, proved to the reformers that the Pope and his kingdom constitute the true Antichrist.
Diaz, tell us more about this word vicar, because I've noticed that the popes like to use this word a lot in their views concerning their ultimate authority.
Vicar. The word vicar is used constantly in papal documents. Leonard Wolsey Bacon, an inside view of the Vatican Council, page 229, tells us, "The Pope is the supreme judge of the law of the land. He is the vicegerent of Christ, who is not only a priest forever, but also King of kings and Lord of lords." Now, people need to realize that the word vicar actually means in place of or instead of. This is the definition of the Greek word anti. Papal documents literally tell us that the Pope is saying, "I am Antichrist." That is literally what they're saying. They are telling us, "I am Antichrist." People in today's churches have seemed to have forgotten that the word anti 2,000 years ago in Greek had the primary meaning of substitution, which the Pope claims to be in place of Christ. The Protestants of the Reformation era, unlike many today who teach the Jesuit systems of prophecy, knew what this word meant in the documents and on the lips of the Pope. John Bradford, between 1510 through 1555, for example, was burned at the stake. Why? Let him tell us. John Bradford says, "Wherefore, I now am condemned and shall be burned as an heretic. For because I will not grant the Antichrist of Rome to be Christ's vicar, general, and supreme head of his church here and everywhere upon earth by God's ordinance." And that is the writings of John Bradford, Sermons, Meditations, Examinations, Volume 1, pages 441 and 442.
This is so amazing, and what amazes me the most is the fact that many today who claim to be Protestant know nothing about Protestant history. If dispensationalists really knew this history of both Protestantism and the views of the papacy, then they should have no trouble identifying the true Antichrist. But they failed. And why have they failed? They failed because they believe in the Jesuit system of futurism, a prophetic system designed to blind people's minds to the truth that we are talking about today. Well, D.S. Ferris, we're about out of time, so we're going to finish the rest of the identifying marks on the next program. But before we close the show, just quickly review what we've studied today and what we're going to be studying next week.
Yes, I will. Up to this point, we have covered 7 identifying marks of the little horn of Daniel chapter 7, and they are as follows. Point number 1, he comes out of Rome. Point number 2, he comes up among the 10 horns. Point number 3, he is different from the surrounding horns. Point number 4, he is stronger than the surrounding horns. Point number 5, he destroyed 3 of the first horns. Point number 6, he has eyes like the eyes of a man. Point number 7, he has a mouth that speaks blasphemies. Every single one of these points has been fulfilled in the Roman Catholic Church. These 7 points are what we have covered in today's show. Next week, we are going to cover points 8, 9, and 10, which consist of, number 8, the little horn would persecute the saints. Point number 9, he would think to change God's set times and laws. And point number 10, he would rule for 1,260 prophetic days. If time permits, next week, we are also going to discuss Revelation chapters 12 and 13 and elaborate further on the system of Antichrist. So in the meantime, Mike, it has been a pleasure speaking on this show, and I look forward to continuing this topic next week. God bless.
D.S. Ferris on Hearing the Truth Radio. Join D.S. and myself every week for Hearing the Truth, and don't forget to check out his book,